I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Larry Mone, president of the Manhattan Institute. On behalf of the Institute's trustees, scholars, and staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 26th annual Walter B. Wriston Lecture. We named the lecture after Walter because he was a great man, a great New Yorker, and a true believer in ideas. His wife Kathy is here tonight. Please join me in welcoming her. Over the past 25 years, we've had an incredible roster of public intellectuals take the podium at the Wriston Lecture, and tonight's speaker, David Mamet, further adds to the event's prestige. We are honored to have him with us. This week has been a difficult one for our area. I live in Hoboken, and I can tell you that the damage there is beyond belief. There's much work to do, and the Manhattan Institute is doing its small part to aid in the recovery. In recent days, Manhattan Institute fellows have been offering ideas on how New Jersey and New York can respond to the dramatic events of the past week, and they will continue to do so in the months ahead. Of course, New Yorkers are a resilient group, and once again are coming together in a time of crisis. As just one example, the Daily News created a disaster relief fund to help the victims of Hurricane Sandy and kicked it off with a $100,000 contribution. I am proud to announce that the Manhattan Institute is providing a contribution to the Daily News Relief Fund. Thanks to the leadership of our chairman, Paul Singer, in the span of a few short hours, we were able to raise $35,000 and counting from the Manhattan Institute's board's members and staff. With many members of the Manhattan Institute's family directly affected by the storm, we are happy to have the opportunity to support the relief efforts in this way. Just let me close again by thanking you for the special effort that I'm sure you made to be here tonight and for your support of the Institute throughout the year. Please enjoy your dinner, and we will be back with you in about an hour to start our formal program. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Singer, chairman of the Manhattan Institute. On behalf of the Institute's trustees, I welcome you this evening. Larry Mone has expressed very well the Institute's commitment to this great city. While many of us here tonight prefer that the government get out of certain areas of our lives, government does have a core purpose. Government is somewhat superior to anarchy and does have a core purpose on which we rely. And not everyone agrees with that previous statement. We thank all those from the city, state, and federal government who are and have been laboring in the face of a daunting and dangerous situation. It has been a difficult few days, and our hearts and prayers go out to those who are suffering from the effects of Hurricane Sandy. But we can take some comfort in the fact that this is an amazingly resilient and strong city. We will come back from this disaster like we have come back from every other setback in our history. And in the midst of everything happening in New York, or shall I say, mitten drinnen, there are very few Jews in this room. That can't be true. You may have heard that there's an election tomorrow. During every election, it's said that this is the most important election of our lifetime. That claim is almost never true, but in this instance, it might be. The choice that the nation makes tomorrow is, in my judgment, at least as important as the one in 1980, and perhaps more so. The stakes could hardly be higher. That's why several months ago, Larry Mone and his team launched Issues 2012, an effort to have MI scholars sharpen the focus on the serious policy issues that we should be discussing in this election season: the economy, taxes, jobs, education, energy, healthcare. I'm pleased to report that the Institute has released over 30 concise papers in the past 9 months, successfully bringing our ideas to editorial pages and talk shows, as well as into candidates' position papers. It was work complemented by major new policy research initiatives, most notably our Power and Growth Initiative. The papers have received a tremendous amount of attention and have been aimed at focusing the public on policy as opposed to politics. As we've seen in recent days, not everything revolves around 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Cities and states have serious challenges and some autonomy. Since its inception, the Manhattan Institute has cared about our great cities and states and has worked with mayors and governors from both parties to make progress on issues like skyrocketing public employee pension benefit costs, crime, quality of life, and education. In addition to New York, MI Fellows have been recently focusing a good deal of time in states like California and Wisconsin, where critical battles were and are being waged. With a large number of policy papers and heavy media engagement, the Manhattan Institute continues to prove itself the most influential think tank in the nation for state and local concerns. City Journal's role in this is quite substantial. Its reporters are vitally important to cities small and large. Tom Sowell, who tonight's Wriston Lecturer David Mamet calls our greatest contemporary philosopher, has recently called City Journal arguably America's greatest magazine. I concur, and I would only add this. If David Mamet can call Tom Sowell our greatest contemporary philosopher, then many of us can call Mamet our greatest contemporary playwright. For over 30 years, David Mamet has been a defining force in theater and film. He has given us some of the great movies and plays of our time, including, of course, his most famous play and film, Glengarry Glen Ross, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. Mamet revolutionized American theater in the 1970s and 80s with his realistic, powerful dialogue. His characters speak the way real, modern Americans speak, honest, direct, and unvarnished. During most of his incredibly successful career, Mamet considered himself an unabashed liberal. It was a rabbi in Los Angeles, Mordecai Finley, with whom he credits with sparking his political conversion by introducing him to conservative giants like Tom Sowell, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman. I must point out that two of those three gentlemen have delivered our Wriston Lecture. In 2008, David Mamet wrote a hugely controversial op-ed for the Village Voice titled, "Why I Am No Longer a Brain-Dead Liberal," in which he began to question some of his former beliefs. Then last year, his conversion complete, Mamet published The Secret Knowledge, an intellectual tour de force that describes the evolution of his mind. In the book, Mamet describes how after much reading and reflection, he came to the conclusion that, quote, "A free market understanding of the world meshes more perfectly with my experiences than that ideological vision I called liberalism." For Mr. Mamet to undergo this intellectual transformation demonstrated two extremely impressive qualities. One is intellectual independence and a commitment to pursue the truth as best as we can understand it. It is never easy to re-examine, with bracing honesty, lifelong assumptions. David Mamet has done that, and in doing so, he set an impressive example to his fellow citizens. But he showed something else as well, and that is courage. I say that because for David Mamet to speak out on behalf of conservatism, particularly given the circles he travels in, was no easy thing. He was cutting against the grain of the professional world, of his professional world. He must have known that taking this stand and doing so in the forthright manner that he did would upset and even enrage people with whom he has worked over the years. But Mamet showed that he believed, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt, aggressive fighting for the right is the noblest sport the world affords. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, "The central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself." In his remarks tonight, Mamet will give us a look into his mind and experiences, the intersection of culture and politics. You're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming David Mamet.
What a magnificent introduction. Thank you very much to Paul, and thank you to Larry Mone, and thank you all here tonight. I was thinking about Harold Pinter, who was a friend of mine, rest in peace, and Harold, when he accepted the Nobel Prize, wrote a rather scathing indictment of the West. And I thought back to a time I was making a movie with Harold, and we were shooting in Whitechapel, or as the Jews of his era called the Witte Chapelle in London, a Jewish neighborhood. And he started reminiscing about his life growing up over his Uncle Morty's radio shop. Harold Pinter was reminiscing over growing up over his Uncle Morty's radio shop in the Jewish area of Whitechapel, and his magnificent radio actor voice became Yiddish and went back to 1938, and his face lit up, remembering those days growing up in the warmth of the Jewish ghetto of London. And I thought, how can Harold Pinter, whom I did and do revere, denigrate the West when, if it weren't for the United States, he and every other Jew in London would have been killed? I thought that was kind of odd. And I was remembering the intersection of his political views and his cultural upbringing, and then I remembered thinking, when Harold first started writing about politics, I was a young writer, maybe in my 20s, and he was probably 50-something, and I thought, isn't that a shame that this wonderful writer has turned into an old man, and all he can do is write about politics because his powers have waned. Well, ha ha. But I think what happens, one of our other great philosophers was Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, a great poet who said in one of his songs that he'd done his fighting, his hoop collaring and crying, and he commenced the studying about the great long time. So I kind of think what I've been doing in the last few years is trying to commence the studying about the great long time, and just as Harold did, to go from thinking about the most minute of human interactions is 2 lines of dialogue, to thinking about what the hell's going on here. And so I wrote this here speech. Thank you. So the 2012 Emmys began with a predictable round of jokes about Republicans, including an exhortation to applaud the fact that there were no Republicans in Hollywood, or any must be in hiding or be very lonely indeed. My question was, what in the world did this partisan humor have to do with a trade show, particularly with a trade show beholden in every moment and in every way to capitalism, to a medium developed to flog goods, by the sale of which those at the Emmys made their living. And what of the barn owl? I quote from the catalog of an old revered American clothing company that branched out into selling knickknacks. Naturally sustainable white poplar barn owl, environmentally friendly and organic-based paint, reclaimed glass eyes, base made of a reclaimed horseshoe. Well, very well and good, but who in the world needs a barn owl? And what is this owl, the composition of which should obsess us? What is the reason behind this compulsivity? It is the continual proclamation that self-government is unnecessary, that one need not apply reason or restraint or courage in the making of difficult decisions, that one need only spout the party line, but that one must do it continually. A group of celebrities lately did a television ad in which they pledged allegiance to Obama. This may differ in degree, but not in kind, from any fascist salute. And when in the world did we begin in this country pledging allegiance to human beings? I brought this along because Joe Kiernan and his daughter wrote this great book, Your Teacher Said What? This is what my child, my 13-year-old, brought home from public school. Are you a Democrat or a Republican? On gun control, a Democrat wants to restrict the number and amount of guns. A Republican wants to allow guns to buy citizens without restriction. On the environment, the Democrat wants to make factories reduce pollution, restrict drilling for oil and national parklands, and a Republican wants not to pass pollution laws that would cost factories money. This is in a public school. If that's not taxation without representation, I don't know what is. That the exhortations of the left are unreasonable and inconsistent ensures that no one will adopt them accidentally because of their utility. They are thus a perfect pledge of allegiance, but their lack of reason ensures that they must be continually repeated as such, and that every possible instance or occasion be introduced by a protestation of faith or an anathema of the other side. Should the leftist omit the obsessive incantations, the repressed, which is doubt, might accidentally intrude. See also the Marine recruit who is or was drilled to begin each sentence, each response with "Sir," lest, as he was instructed, he addend an invitation to offer himself for sex. This was noted by the psychologist de Clerambault in 1921 and known as de Clerambault's syndrome, where here the individual overcome by authority is shocked into compulsive confession of his willingness to submit. As with house guests and strangers, one in the liberal community is continually taxed with establishing his bona fides. In a happy family or a work environment or a religious organization, a community in short, one may relax this inquisition and get on with the communal tasks. This is the most immediate effect of the benefit of community, and from this the other benefits flow. In accepting community standards and committing oneself to their propagation, one trades some potential freedom of action. We are not going to let the kids grow up and choose, or I am going to make a commitment. I consider myself a citizen of the world as an example of one who won't accept responsibility. In a community, one trades some freedom of action for increased security in the moment. And true community members share certain basic assumptions, and so their behavior is more predictable. They may violate community standards, but the penalty, which is excommunication, shame, or ostracism, is clear and costly, and so transgression of the norms is more restricted. But time with strangers must constantly be spent establishing the limits of intimacy. Our most compact social unit is the family and functions almost completely in modes of behavior so long and definitely established that they become unconscious. In the family, how one greets, praises, reprimands, apologizes, lies, demands, complains. These forms, though unconscious, are, to the family familiar, completely known and completely clear. And the inclusion of even the most beloved of house guests shatters the ease of the family interaction. And the knowledge previously consigned to the unconscious mind must be brought to mind to the conscious, explained, altered, or suspended for the benefit of the guest. Which is why, as Mr. Franklin told us, fish and visitors begin to stink after 3 days. The toll in energy is huge. Tolstoy says that you know when a marriage is falling apart as the husband and wife's conversation progresses logically. He was one smart Jew. It's impossible to convene even the smallest and most transitory of human groups without them improvising if they cannot discover a social structure, which is to say, a culture. Culture grows in mysterious ways, and its growth has nothing to do with reason. Is it reasonable, for example, that all Americans have to say what seems to be the trouble officer? Where is it written? Or that they have to say, hi, we can't come to the phone right now, but if you leave your name and number. Where in the world are these forms prescribed? A culture extemporizes itself in observances in response to communal necessity, to deal with which it also extemporizes myths. These myths, no less than political views or modes of organization, can derive only from the limited recurring number of human problems and human solutions. The left's discovery of global warming, the sinfulness of man causing the seas to rise and so destroy humankind, may also be found in Genesis 6. And consider the taking of snapshots. Before the shutters click, the photographer says 1, 2, 3. Why? Well, here's why. I think in the first days of portrait photography, an exposure could last up to 3 minutes. So the sitters' heads were mobilized by a brace because they couldn't move or else the shot would be foggy. They were instructed to stay perfectly still, and as the 3 minutes started to end, the photographer would reassure them, almost done, 1, 2, 3, now we're done. Contemporary cameras can take a snapshot in 1,000th of a second, but still the photographer says 1, 2, 3. Why? Because photographers have always said 1, 2, 3. But now the phrase is uttered before the shot. And if asked why, the photographer might say to allow the subject to compose himself. But why does the subject need to compose himself? This makes every amateur portrait the lifeless same. The subject's face having adopted that self-same, I am now getting my picture taken mode. In the original photos, the sitters looked still and stern and had to hold still. In the contemporary posed shots, every one of us looks like a fool. Not only is exposure instantaneous, there's no need for stillness, but it persists and turns without thought and seemingly without human intervention, from the useful to the residuals and the destructive. Cities each have their own culture. In San Francisco, a greeting to a stranger is likely to be returned. In New York, ignored, and in Los Angeles, responded to with frigid rage. Likewise, of course, there's our beautiful American culture. It can be found most readily in our jokes, puns, or allusions, in the illusions of stand-up comedy and television commercials. Are television commercials the lowest denominator of culture? Of course, and thus they're the most powerful and cohesive. Here's a great television commercial we saw at the Super Bowl. There's a holocaust of some time, a city's buried in rubble. Later, tough trucks of the manufacturer's brand emerge one by one from the rubble, and the drivers get out to congratulate each other, all glad to be alive and having had the wisdom to purchase so great a truck. And one survivor says to another, have a Twinkie. So what do we have here but an allusion to a magnificent American myth, an urban legend taken from the very schoolyard where we've told each other for 50 years, Twinkies have a shelf life of 10 million years. So why might people buy the truck? Because in enjoying the illusion, enjoying the commonality, they were united in the most happy of experiences, which is belonging. The left ridicules the notion of culture and enshrines intellect. To them, it's logical that all things may be reasoned through, and that if we were just sufficiently intelligent to choose more intelligent leaders, all the age-old problems must disappear. But in the celebration of omnipotent intellect, we citizens become, as those house guests, dedicated to figuring out how a family works and how, first of all, to refrain from offending each other. Out goes patriotism, religion, free enterprise, freedom of conscience, free exercise of legal rights, which anyone takes the soapbox and alleges might offend. Out, in short, goes the culture. But now we are stymied because we don't know how to replace those practices. So a new culture is improvised. Speak to no one at the airport, ride for 12 hours across across the ocean and don't introduce yourself. Don't talk to anybody on the elevator. Keep your mouth shut, because anything might offend. Alter your speech in response to any suggestion that it might offend, and demand from all a fealty to the one uniting power, the new culture, whose champion is the left, for you yourself, as you know, without a culture, are alone and confused and lost. The Obama campaign's 2008 change may thus be understood as a directive, the whole of which is change or suffer. Shall you stand up or sit down when the Star-Spangled Banner is sung? Shall you sing or not? Should a man open a door for a woman? Is it permitted for whites to criticize a failed politician if he's black? Are terrorists entitled to the same protections enjoyed by citizens? Should folks of the same sex be allowed to marry? Has he or she replaced he as the correct pronoun? They're operationally the same question, as they create fear, as the questioner has no idea where to look for guidance or clarification. Just like the house guest and the host locked in the least terminable of discussions, the insistence on deference in all things, the mutual desire to express courtesy driving both sides mad. This fear of a cultural vacuum is filled historically by the spontaneous emergence of two aides, a leader and an enemy. The culturally unsettled need a strong man, someone unquestionably superior to themselves in vision and intellect, and thus deserving that allegiance which will replace the structure sacrificed in the culture's abandonment. This is the czar so beloved of the left. Lenin, Marx, Freud, Castro, Stalin, Hitler, Karzar, enemy czar, director of bisexual, trans, gay, lesbian questing and queer studies, someone in whom one can believe in the midst of, quote, the mess we have inherited, which was previously known as the United States of America. See also Jim Jones, Sun Myung Moon, Bernie Madoff, and all those claiming by intellect or faith they can supervene the natural laws. If there were such a thing as historical necessity, why in the world would we have to aid it? Must one not question at least the sense of proportion of a human being who proclaimed they will say that under us the seas cease to rise? These ideologues, opportunists, visionaries, quacks, and thugs seem to lead, but as per Tolstoy, they actually emerge from and ride for power impelled by the mass confusion of the unbalanced group. The political impulse to submission, for all it is explained as more reasonable than outmoded forms, representative government, religion, and culture, may also be seen allied to the impulse by those in extremis that seek out magic. The client of the psychic healer and energy therapist, bloodless surgeon, past lives therapist, and the worshiper of the political strongman each trade autonomy for magic. But the power, the magic feathers, the magic beans, the stimulus, like the resurrection of Tinkerbell, cannot be attempted without sacrifice. Here, the sacrifice of reason, the contemporary equivalent of gashing the flesh to make it rain. Sacrifice, of course, implies a supernatural recipient, indeed an angry God, and it requires an intercessor, a strong man, a priest, perhaps a demigod himself, to teach us the acceptable forms. The political dupe may be questioned by his non-afflicted brother to adduce reasons why the failed politician, the incipient dictator, the flim-flam man, the pretender to godhood, should be supported when his words are meaningless, his promises either inchoate or failed, and his word proved worthless. But this misses the point. For as with the psychic healer, it is not the promised result of submission for which the afflicted is paying, but for the experience of submission itself, which is a real, if transitory, cure for his anxiety. The victim of the mystic healer is kept in the fold by promises the treatment will work, but it will take more money, more time, or belief than previously suspected. And the victim of the demagogue, quizzical about the failure of his idol to accomplish anything promised, is also schooled, indeed self-schooled, that the magic just needs time to work, that the disease was worse than previously imagined, and to suggest otherwise is not only illogical but impious. He, this political dupe, just like the object of an intervention, can cathect any residual doubt as rage onto those who are trying to help him. This may be understood as demonic, as they seem to require both his apostasy and his psychic dissolution. The exercise of total faith is that benefit for which the leftist has paid with his autonomy. Its merest weakening is to him equal to psychological death. Consider it leaves him alone. For if deprived by doubt, of his essential identity with the believing group, he's also, of course, deprived of potential community with its opponents, whom he has just recently denounced as the devil. And man is a social animal. So no prodigy of sophistry is too great nor too embarrassing to those threatened with this stranding. President Obama, they say, fell apart on television because he was unused to the altitude in Denver. He was unresponsive, as to have answered back would have branded him as an uppity Negro. This is the President of the United States. See also the absolutely autonomic emergence in the liberal community and the spontaneous sequential adoption of excuses for his failure. Look at the mess he inherited. You just oppose him because he's a black man. Any program needs time. The system itself is broken. The job's too big for one man. And finally, you know what? They're all the same. We human beings are lonely, and that's why we're interested in life on other planets, in past lives, and in politics. That's why we fantasize about and adopt small groups, gays, blacks, Palestinians, the handicapped, as totems. This, in addition to an expression of legitimate humanitarian concerns, is the delightful fantasy that these groups are compressed by difficulties into a magnificent pure unity unavailable to the mass. We, the larger polity, imagine them in fact as tribes, which is to say exotics, enjoying all the benefits of that gift of culture which we in the larger group have wished away. These tribes, we feel, possess to perfection those two things the victim of anomie seeks in its political subjugation: communal purpose and an enemy. The left names this enemy big business, the corporations, the 1%, the homophobe, the rich, the Jews, America. This enemy is necessary not because the troubled are hateful, but because they're weakened. They've become weak through the constant, intolerable expenditure of energy in the improvisation of a culture, like the strangers on a cruise perpetually bantering. A house guest in what was previously his own country, the leftist, who has quite literally pledged allegiance to Obama, fears that his most precious possession, belief, may encounter a rational challenge, either from himself or from another, which is insurmountable, and that his faith then must fail. But the priceless appearance of a foul fiend can enliven his resolve, calling not upon his exhausted belief, but upon his inexhaustible courage. I would suggest the beleaguered leftist reimagines himself as Horatius at the bridge, but that poem, universally read in the public schools of my youth, is no longer of cultural currency. And which of the songs of my youth remain? Casey at the bat, Columbia, the gem of the ocean, Captain, my captain, the Star-Spangled Banner, the Lord's Prayer, the Kaddish, the Communion, the Mass, the Deacon's one-horse shay, the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. Those various productions of poetry, universally read 50 years ago, are replaced in the Brave New World by slogans and the reduction of debatable propositions to commands. Celebrate diversity, for example, where once we did not exhort but practiced the celebration of its polar opposite, unity, the exhortation still appearing on our coins. English literature until the late mid-century was largely elusive. It assumed a common knowledge of the Bible, the Gospels, the Constitution, the works of Shakespeare, and various poets of that region of time. There is that called poetry still written today, but I defy anyone here to quote one line read as recently as last week. And yet we remember for our entire lives that which moved us not by command or by appeal to the intellect, but by resonance with the soul, which is, as opposed to political beliefs, we all share. I remember Oliver Wendell Holmes' poem, The One-Horse Shay. Have you heard of the wonderful one-horse shay that was built in such a logical way? It ran 100 years to the day, and then of a sudden, but stay. I'll tell you what happened without delay. Scaring the parson into fits, frightening the people out of their wits. Have you heard of that, I say? And then he goes on to characterize how it all fell apart in one instant after 100 years, and it ends. You'll see, of course, if you're not a dunce, it went to pieces all at once and nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that in 1858, and in 1972, Sir John Glubb, a British historian, wrote a pamphlet called The Fate of Empires, 1972, and he wrote that the great empires, Assyria, Persia, Greece, the Roman, the Arab empires, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, Russia, Britain each flourished for around 250 years, and this seems to be the space allotted for imperial hegemony. Too long a period of power leads to decadence, and that as the family goes from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, so the empire goes from the pioneers to the innovators to the bureaucrats, from exploration and exploitation to decadence, the quest for world approval, the welfare state, and squabbles over inherited wealth. And a notable feature, he writes, of the declining nations is the loss of physical energy. Glubb suggests, as does the Bible, that the state as a human organism is no different than the family. Both recapitulate human individual tendencies and, like the individual human, evolve in predictable directions. The human might indeed live to be 120 years, but no longer, and will decay through predictable stages, as will the family, however wealthy, and the state, however powerful. And now we in America are at the outward end of Sir John Glubb's 250 years, and we see the signs posited by Glubb. We've passed through the ages of outburst, conquest, commerce, affluence, intellect, and we've come to the age of decadence. This, in all empires, he writes, can be identified by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, frivolity, the welfare state, the dissolution of the armed forces, the weakening of religion, and the attempt to curry favor in the world. But he also wrote a companion essay called The Search for Survival, in which he writes that every one of us can contribute to the recovery of our country by working harder and by fostering a sense of comradeship and good work, and that only a revival of spiritual devotion, not fashionable isms, can inspire selfless service, and each of us can contribute by leading moral and dedicated lives, and by speaking and writing in that sense. And if we have no leaders, we must go it alone. In the Chicago public schools, we regularly read The Lay of the Last Minstrel, Horatius at the Bridge. And perhaps, as in Horatius at the Bridge, it is not quite the time to ask, how can man die better than by facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers in the temple of his gods? Perhaps that time is not quite yet, but it's evident that the time for sacrifice for the sake of the country and the Judeo-Christian values on which it was founded is near. The left's insistent on the absolute primacy of their notions regarding abortion, birth control, sex education, sterilization, and gay rights. In looking at these, we might be reminded again that Tolstoy reminds us the first visible signals of a change are often mistaken for the mode of force. The bow wave, which we see first, is the most apparent but does not impel the ship. The smoke, which we see first, is the most apparent but does not impel the locomotive. The shibboleths of the left, similarly, seem to be the championship of various causes taken in toto, however, and independent of protestation. They call for a lowering of the birth rate, which is one of the first and a universal sign of national decline. See also the attendant call from the left for the lowering or abolition of the requirements for citizenship. The left would say the traditional definitions of such are an egregious example of American exceptionalism, which is to say arrogance, that we are first citizens of the world. But citizenship implies defined rights and obligations. What rights does an American have in North Korea, Iran, China, or for that matter in Indonesia? And what rights does an American Jew, gay, or a woman enjoy in Syria? What obligations do we have to the French nation? To suggest we're citizens of the world destroys our understanding of the term and so weakens us in the performance of the duties of a citizen. One might say that the apogee of American power was the 1969 moon landing, and since then we, the most successful empire in history, according to the greatest access to prosperity, happiness, and public life in history, have been in a decline. This decline, as Gibbon told us, is inevitable. Nothing lasts forever. This period of diminishing American hegemony, however, may be one of healthy age. We citizens are the owners of its country and its board of directors, and we may find the strength to reasonably consider the options open to us in this confusing time. None of them is perfect. And this is a sign we must make a moral choice, which is to say a choice between two flawed or indeed bad alternatives. If we do not choose, the choice will be made for us by those interested at home and abroad in weakening the power of the American electorate. It's not a brave announcement that our country is imperfect, none of the works of man is perfect, but it is our country to govern, to defend, and to enjoy as long as we choose to set our minds to it. Thank you. I talked too long?
Stay right there. We'll field some questions.
Thank you. I think I talked too long.
I think we're going to have a few questions. So there are two people with microphones. Raise your hand and please wait for the microphone, and we'll try to get to as many people as we possibly can. Jim, we'll start here. All right? Jim Pearson.
I'm Jim Pearson. Mr. Mamet, thank you very much for that thoughtful address. Thank you. Let me ask you a question about Hollywood culture with which you began your address. And it's always been political to some degree. In the 1950s, we had Ronald Reagan and Adolph Manjou, the Hollywood 10. Mm-hmm. Today, we have Robert Redford, Barbra Streisand. So you described the culture. What is the dynamic, in your opinion, that drives it to the left? And are there any signs, perhaps maybe in your own career, by which it might be redirected before it brings us all down like the one-horse shay?
Well, you know, in my racket of show business, and particularly in Hollywood, we're fantasists. If you look at the people who are trying to save the world, various movie stars who are trying to save it in the 30s and 40s, you know, the phrase in Hollywood was, "Breathe there a man with soul so dead he was not in the 30s red." Okay, so the fantasists in the 30s and the fantasists in the 40s and the fantasists today are saving the world in every movie. It makes sense that they're going to start believing their own press notices, and that's what we see. I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but I liked saying it.
We have a question way in the back.
Hi, Ben Boychuk. You're a connoisseur of the confidence man. You've given us some of the great confidence men in theater and in film. Jimmy Dell is one of my favorite confidence men because you made Steve Martin a villain. I wonder, as you look upon the political scene today, how do you assess President Obama as a confidence man in the panoply of confidence men? And not to put a fly in the ointment, but how do you assess Mitt Romney as a confidence man?
Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, it's like they say they're going to work their side of the street, and I'm going to work mine. I heard Condoleezza Rice talk about several weeks ago, and someone said, "Oh my God, you know, Dr. Rice, you're so brilliant, you're so funny, you're so smart, you're so patriotic. Why don't you run for president?" She said, "I just don't have it in me." She said, "Well, I used to tour with George Bush, and at the end of the day, he was raring to go, and at the end of the day, I was raring to shoot myself." So there are these people in our evolved system who spend their whole life doing press and begging, and they're called politicians. And once in a while, a public servant, we get one who also has the capacity to be a public servant and has a little time left over at the end of the day between lying and begging to take care of the country. And as Milton Friedman said, we just don't have the time to bone up on the people who are trying to rob us through the X corporation, and the people who are trying to rob us through the Y union, and the people who are getting a subsidy for this and the people who are getting a subsidy for that. Because we think about it for 10 seconds a year, and they think about it all day, every day. So there's only one thing that we can do, and that's to cut taxes and to slash the size of the government. And that's because, you know, who knows if they're a confidence man? I don't know. You know, I met Mitt Romney. I like him very much. I like everything he ever did. I shook his hand. You know, on the other hand, I actually grew up and was born on the south side of Chicago, where Obama claims to come from, and was born in Hyde Park. And I saw that whole substratum of. I see everything through that. Through that. Of course, they're all confidence men. Next question.
We have a question here.
Well, Glen Ross is reopening, I gather, in Revival with Al Pacino playing a different role. Your great and striking plays are rather cynical about American capitalism, and no great problem there. Interestingly, Harold Pinter, a great left-winger, his great plays seem to have nothing to do with his political message. But as a great artist who's written some great plays, do you see yourself evolving in some way, that in some way the way you articulate your politics and your view of culture is going to be incorporated in your art in some way?
Well, I don't think any of my plays are political. I certainly hope they aren't. And also, I don't think Harold's plays were political. You know, he wrote a couple of short, overtly political plays late in life, Mountain Language and a couple of others, but his plays were just yummy. And I don't think it's the place of the theater to be political. You know, it's I shouldn't even be here tonight, actually, you know. Was I critical of capital? I don't know if I was critical of capital. I was driving a cab at the time I wrote most of those early plays. And I'm not driving a cab anymore. And so, you know, I see if you're writing the same play at 65 as you were at 19, you're doing something wrong.
I saw Heather Higgins raise her hand, so why don't we get a microphone to her?
Thanks very much. When you talk about the doubt that is being suppressed by courage and belief, and you have now come out of the political closet, what are the doubts that you find are the most fertile ground for you when you're talking with your colleagues, trying to persuade them to perhaps have the same epiphanies that you have had? What are the arguments that you find?
The arguments that I find about what, ma'am? The arguments that I find about what?
When you're trying to explain your political transition and the understandings that you now have that you didn't used to have, where are the greatest doubts? Where is it that you have the greatest success in trying to persuade others to see the world as you now see it?
I can't persuade anybody. I don't have that power. I mean, I certainly wouldn't attempt it in the play, and the only people I ever talk to are conservatives. I mean, you know, if there are any liberals here tonight, you're lost. You're in the wrong room. I don't try to persuade any. I don't try to persuade anybody. I'll tell you what. I met my first conservative was a friend of a friend, and I'd never met a conservative in my life, and I was impressed by him because he answered questions. He was very composed, and he was very patient, and he was very simple, and he wasn't rancorous, and he tried to gauge his responses to the level of my request, and he was very welcoming. And over the course of a year, I thought, I don't understand anything this guy's saying, but he's so damn polite that maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there's something in his convictions. It's like the old argument between the two great rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and the Talmud gave they retired the cup and gave it to Hillel, not because his argument was better, but because he was more polite to Shammai. I really think that breaking free of the bubble is a terrible hard. I think it's breaking free of the addiction of thought, and it starts in the public schools, and it starts in the private schools, and it starts in one half of the media, and it's dreadfully hard to break, especially as our country spreads itself into political enclaves. That one goes through one's whole life never meeting a conservative or never meeting a liberal if you're in the other camp. So any of us who've had the wonderful experience of trying to convince a liberal by reason have come to appreciate the value of a trip to the dentist.
Okay, we have a question over in the corner.
David DeRocher. I'm a big fan of Glen Ross, particularly the opening scene where the compensation structure is laid out. So first prize, Cadillac, second prize, set of steak knives, third prize, you're fired. I think what you gave tonight was a Cadillac of a speech, albeit a black Cadillac, one that might go in the front procession of a funeral. Is there anything that you might be able to tell us? I mean, particularly, I accept your diagnosis and your prognosis, but could you give some Mamet speech into what we could do to actually keep this experiment in self-government going? Maybe even as you ended your last statement about how it can start in education. How
do you start in education? Yeah, I mean, I go through it all day. My wife and I got a 13-year-old at home, and you got to sit him down. We were taking him out of that school and try to find him some school that's not in the pod. I think it's important to tell the truth. I don't think that one has to be politically confrontational. I don't think that it's productive, and I don't think it's polite. But I think once in a while, when we have the opportunity, perhaps if someone comes to us and says, you know what, would you explain your positions to me? To, as I'm sure all of you do who happen to be conservative, say, sure, I'd be happy to. Please tell me where I'm wrong. And I think other than that, I don't know what we can do, because I mean, I haven't slept in the last 2 years. I don't know if anybody here has. And it's enough already. And I don't think it's the most important election since 1980. I think it's the most important election since 1860. I really do. Yeah.
Okay. Avik Roy there, and then we'll get the other question in the middle there. That's fine.
Why aren't there more conservative playwrights? And is there anything that can be done about that, or is that essential? Is that just inherent to the human condition and the nature of playwriting?
Well, here's the thing: you can't breed playwrights. You really can't. I mean, I knew Joe Papp, knew him very, very well. He was a great, wonderful guy, the biggest con man who ever lived. And he kept shaking down the state and the government and the rich people, anybody who'd listen. And he did a Hamlet with Eskimos, and he did the women with an all-female cast. He did he would just do any goddamn thing. He didn't care. But that's not the place for politics. And unfortunately, the contemporary theater comes out of the university system. I was very fortunate. William H. Macy and me and Joe Mantegna and a whole bunch of people, and William Peterson and Dennis Franz and all those guys. We were all kids in Chicago, 22 years old, and we had our own theater companies. We didn't know any better. We made it up as we went along. But kids nowadays, I think that they're doing that on the internet, or they're doing it on them twitting, whatever the hell they do. But they don't. But they study the theater and awarded for doing the theater in universities, which are all the liberal arts universities are completely democratic. And so the kids, rather than having the experience of the free market, which me and Macy and Billy Peterson, Franz and Farina had, you got to please the audience or they ain't coming back tomorrow, have the unfortunate experience of growing up trying to please the teacher, right? Which is, and you can't, and that's not theater. And so they grow out of this. That's where the playwrights come from. And then they come to New York, and so you have your pick of affliction plays. Who's going to be on the barrel this season, so we can come out humming the fact that X, Y, Z are people too, and feel good about ourselves. You got to have a place. You got to have a place to. Got to have a place to fail. And I'll tell you a really good clue. You ever look at somebody's resume and you say they won the following play competitions, X, Y, Z. You don't have to read their plays. They can't write.
We had a question there in the
middle.
Yes,
just to follow up on that, I would love to get your opinion on the work of your New York Times esteemed colleague, Tony Kushner.
Tony Kushner's going to work his side of the street, and I'm going to work mine. We have he's a very good writer. He's a very good writer. We have very different political views. That's the great thing about free speech. It lets. I get the right to put on my plays if I can find enough suckers, to invest in them. And so does he. And some of them are in the audience like, yes, and I'm glad I said it. Okay. We'll let it fight it out. We'll fight it out, and posterity will be its own judge, and what will it mean to all of us? We'll all be gone, big deal.
Okay, there's another question in the middle there somewhere. Yeah, right. Why don't you grab that?
Hi, my name is Phil Mills. I'm an actor. And I was I was really interested in what you were saying about we humans as social animals and about excommunication. And I was wondering if you had your, intellectual conversion earlier in life, before you were less established and a little bit older, would you have been more reticent to be vocal about it? Or would in
You bet.
Yeah. Okay, good to know.
I'm pretty arrogant, but I don't think I'm stupid. That's a different thing. You know, somebody coming up and they got a family, a wife or husband, a kid to support, and sometimes you got to look at the Jewish tradition says the law of the land is the law. So sometimes it's a good idea to keep your head down, and sometimes it's not. And is it true that I had enjoy a position such that I felt immune to a certain amount of harmful criticism? Yeah, that is true. And had it happened earlier, I don't know. It's an excellent question. Thank you.
Question back here in the center.
Yeah, quick question. Do you have a community organizer? And if so, do you know what his name is?
I'm sorry.
No, would you repeat the question,
The
please?
question is, do you have a community organizer? And if so, do you know what his name is?
Do I have
A community organizer? And do you know what his name is?
Do I have a community organizer? Listen, a community organizer, you know, I grew up and all my parents knew Saul Alinsky and all those Saul Alinsky lights and the Woodlawn organization in Hyde Park. A community organizer is just another name for a thug. That's all a community organizer. Has anyone ever have you read the works of Saul Alinsky? Reveille for Radicals. What's the other one? There's two thoughts about radicals. And also to the young actor over there, you know, also I realize it's not my job to walk on a set and say, all you brain-dead liberals over here, have you not read Friedrich Hayek? You know? So the people are going to be talking about the water cooler, so big deal, let them talk.
One last question here.
Yeah, one last question, yeah.
Can you tell us about your new play, The Anarchist? Can you tell us about your new play, The Anarchist?
Yeah, oh goody. I got a new play, it's The Anarchist, and Howard Kagan and Jeffrey Richards, who are here tonight, produced it, God bless you. And it's a play about, it's kind of a pastiche of it's Patty Lupone plays a weatherman, one of the bombers, you know, one of those killers from the, you know, Bill Ayers, for example, Bernadette Dorn, Angela Davis, all of those wonderful political icons who are now teaching in our higher education. But she plays kind of an amalgam of perhaps not quite Kathy Boudin, but maybe, what was there was another woman who just got caught after 30 years, and Susan something or other, she went back in the joint. And so or one of the Bader Meinhof women. So Patty Lupone plays one of these women who was a terrorist, and she's been in jail, and she's up for a parole hearing, and the person who's been her parole officer for 30 years, played by Deborah Winger, is interrogating her, trying to make up her mind whether to let her go or not. And I think it's pretty cute. You know, it's all about... I mean, you're going to leave, you know, humming selections from Lombroso and Marx. And who could ask for anything more? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.